for supporting Voices of the Fall. So we started this, Novi and I started this initiative last year, and this will be our third event. We do Voices of the Fall and Voices of the Spring. We already have had the poet, the Uruguayan poet Sylvia Goldman. We had the Dominican writer Kiani Antigua. Um, and now we have the pleasure to have Oswaldo Estrada. But before introducing you to Oswaldo, I also wanted to thank the students that are here today for their support, and I always thank them for their resilience. That's an inspiration for all of us. To our colleagues too, that are taking the time to spend in their lunch hour with us. Um, and also to Dean Marek and our chair, Jason Singsheim. I've been trying since yesterday, practicing to pronounce his last name. Well, so sorry about that if I mispronounce it. I met Osvaldo. I met Osvaldo a long time ago. We met at Brown University during a conference down there, and then he was gracious enough to invite me to Chapel Hill to read from my novel Candela. So that was one of the first time as a student and as a scholar that I got invited to an institution. So I appreciate that he gave me that chance. And from that first meeting, came out an interview that he was, and again, gracious enough to publish in a magazine called Hispamerica, which he's part of. So it was one of the first big breaks for me as a writer, and also, because I like to combine creativity with academia. So for me, that was very, very important. All that to say that for me is a pleasure to have him today, being on the other side, inviting him and being able to share his knowledge with all of us. Dr. Osvaldo Estrada is not only a professor in Latin American literature at Chapel Hill University, but lately he has blossomed into a prolific fiction writer. Osvaldo was born in the United States but went back to Peru with his family, where he lived. He was 14 years old. I want to thank you, Osvaldo, for being here with us today. And I would like to start this conversation with you with the following question. How I'm interested to know how this movement of transculturation for you, how that impact your scholarship, but also your fiction as a writer.
Much for this very kind invitation. I'm super excited to be here with you. And of course, I want to thank your chair, your dean, but also doctors Novia Pagon and Rey Andújar, who are dear friends of mine. And I feel really at home, even though we have this this computer in front of us. I feel like, we're good friends, and I'm going to try to forget, about all the technological issues that we may have along the way. And just going back to your question, Ray, as an immigrant, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, immigration issues and crossing borders and bringing all that baggage from Latin America with you is always present when I'm doing research, when I'm writing. And of course, for us, it's hard to separate, right? Your creative writing from your scholarship. So in terms of my scholarship, I've read and I've studied works by Juan Rulfo, Carlos Fuentes, Cristina Rivera Garza, whose work in many ways do cross borders and the barriers of a language as well. But I'm also thinking of Latino writers who might be closer to our own reality. I'm thinking, for instance, of Guatemalan American Maya Chinchilla, who's a great poet and who's written about this, or of Juno Diaz, for instance, Santiago Vaquera Vasquez, or Daniel Alarcón, who's Peruvian-American, like myself. So this is always in the back of my head, precisely because I've gone through the immigrant experience. A lot of people, yesterday I had an interview and the first question was like, so tell us, how is it that you were born in the US but you grew up in Peru. Are you Peruvian, or you were just there? So I'm Peruvian, 100%. But my parents ended up here in the 70s, and when I was 4 months old, they went back to Peru, and so I grew up speaking Spanish only. And so that's my life, the story of my life. When I came when I was 14, I had to learn English, and of course I had to learn how to navigate this system and to live in this world, to become a new me, a new version of myself. Because in Spanish in Peru, of course, I could speak the language. I was very outgoing, and then all of a sudden I couldn't express myself in English, in the target language. So that has also, invaded in the best possible way my own creative writing. And of course now, as a Latino writer here in the US, as a Peruvian-American writer, I'm deeply concerned with what's going on with the reality of our own immigrants, of our own DACA students, for instance. I was thinking of sharing for this first segment one of a story that I wrote originally in English for an event that I'm sure you had something like this in Chicago last year, Writers for Migrant Justice, because this event was happening all over the States, um, because people were protesting against what was going on with children detained at the border, DACA students, and so on. The title of the story that I wrote originally in English is A Sip of Benadryl. We can talk about translation later, because the story I had to translate it into my own native Spanish to publish it in one of my books. But it goes like this. A sip of Benadryl. Sleep tight, she said, and I'll be here when you open your eyes. Be good, Elena. Don't say anything, and don't you cry. Just sit here still for a little while. Mommy loves to tell the story of how I was so obedient that I fell asleep at her command to cross the border in the back seat of an old Dodge, pretending to be the third child of a Mexican family with papers, holding onto my blankie and sucking my thumb. I don't remember any of this, but I've heard the story so many times that I imagine myself there, wearing a pink dress and matching hair bows for my pigtails, afraid, I'm sure, but trusting her completely. It was a warm day. Street vendors walked through the cars, waiting in line, selling sombreros, piñatas, loteria cards, necklaces, and cheap alcohol, small guitars. I was what, 2.5? Mommy always changes this part, and what she never tells anyone is that she gave me Benadryl. That stuff can kill you if you're under 5, but she had no other choice. I slept like an angel, she tells her close friends, skipping the part where I could have died. How long did it take her to walk over to the other side? How many steps did she take? Scared, with her tourist visa in her hand, praying that I wouldn't wake up screaming for her as the Vega family passed the inspection points in San Isidro and San Clemente. Standing in line with others who enter the country with their blue passports and their green cards. I've heard that people wait in line up to an hour or two on a busy day. She says it didn't take her that long, or she was too busy praying to San Judas Tadeo. Mommy, all skinny and courageous, dressed out for the occasion in that red summer dress she bought at El Palacio de Hierro. An investment, she reminds me, in a weekender bag with the only nice clothes she was able to get out of the house when my grandparents rescued us. She swears she was there when I woke up, paid the Mexican family $1,500, and kept the rest for Greyhound tickets to North Carolina. I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone cross the entire country to come all the way here, right? In a bus. Believe me, I've asked Mommy a million times. I would have stayed, I don't know, in California where most people look like us, or in Nevada, New Mexico if you want, Texas for God's sake. But no, Mommy had to come all the way here because her brother knew of someone in Carborough who would give her work and a place to live. That's what she says anyway. I think she wanted to get as far away as possible from the border, knowing that her visa would expire in a few months, or that my father could find us if we stayed anywhere near Mexico. So here I am, 16 years later, enrolled in your first year seminar. I've been good all this time, got A's in high school, did some community work, fed the homeless on Thanksgiving Day, did everything they tell you to do to get yourself admitted. You want us to write a cultural autobiography describing our background, the path that has brought us to college. and I just want to close my eyes and fall asleep in the back seat of that old Dodge. Mommy says we're lucky to be here, that she'd do it again for me and for her, that she'd clean houses 8, 10 hours a day, even if those chemicals have destroyed her lungs. I know we're lucky. We stayed together through thick and thin, didn't end up in a cage waiting for my turn to be deported. But my heart stops when I see a police car in the corner of Johns Ferry Road, right across from the Guadalupana store. I never make a fuss if I'm mistreated when I ask for the restroom, when I'm told that I don't have a reservation, even if I do, or if somebody gives me a nasty look for speaking my language. Don't say anything, mommy tells me time and again. Just walk away. I'm used to being quiet, and now you want us to participate, to share our thoughts, our feelings, to debate. But I can't help it. Americans love to protest about tuition in classes, about animal rights, certain monuments. I don't care if I'm arrested, they say, all proud, unafraid. But we can't. We have to keep a low profile. Go unnoticed, mommy warns me. Meanwhile, gringos tell their children to become politicians and surgeons, scientists, or the next president of the United States. I'm Elena Lopez, professor, but I could be Mariel Hernandez, or Felinda Garcia, Jenny Mendez. I sit in the back, away from the door, and hardly ever talk. I can't watch movies that portray domestic violence. They remind me that my life would be different if mommy and I hadn't had to escape from that. She wants me to become a teacher or a nurse, but I like to become a lawyer to help people like me, people whose nights would be insufferable without a sip of Benadryl. Thank you.
Oh, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Again, I would like to thank everybody that is with us today. And I'm going to ask maybe two more questions, and then I'm going to try to open the conversation, because maybe you guys would like to also ask questions to Oswaldo. Oswaldo is the author of cultural and literary criticism books like Ser Mujer y Estar Presente, To Be a Woman and Be Present, and also Troubled Memories, Iconic Mexican Women and the Traps of Representation. Um, I wanted to ask you, Oswaldo, to talk a little bit about the violence in your writing. I can see that that's a theme in both your literary academic research, but also in your creative writing. I wanted you to see if you can talk to us about the difference between the two, if there is any, and also why the gender violence interests you so much, especially in relationship like to violence towards women, for example.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I, inevitably you are who you are, and I come from Peru, and I lived during the turbulent 80s in Peru, when we had terrorism and there was an armed conflict between the Shining Path and the Peruvian state. And believe it or not, that has influenced my life, my writing, in many ways. And I'm always writing about that. I'm going to change the speaker to so that I can see all of you, not myself when I'm talking. And so it's always there. And as an academic, I've worked on this. I've published a few books and some articles on this issue of violence and how it affects you. And the same way as crossing the border, right? It's not just the physical aspect of crossing from one country to another, but how it transforms you mentally and for the rest of your life. And the same thing happens with violence. Right now, for instance, over just the past week, we've had 3 different Peruvian presidents within a week, and we've had protests, and people have gone out to the streets protesting against the government. Now we have a brand new president as of yesterday. But just looking at that reminds me of what my childhood was like, without food and electricity, always scared that a car would explode, in the middle of the street as I was going to school. And imagine being a parent. It must have been so hard for my mother. So of course I've lived through those years. I've inherited all of that. And so now that I'm, that I work on memory studies and also on historical amnesia on that other side. I try to articulate and re-articulate issues related to violence, both in my scholarship and also in my own creative writing. So oftentimes, without wanting to, I end up writing about, violence and gender violence, also in particular in some of my stories. And you know how this is. You don't, sit down, you're like, okay, I'm going to write about this woman who's undergoing domestic violence. But it just sort of happens. It's like the story was there waiting for you. And I don't know how you are, Rey, when it comes to this, but I usually think of the first lines of the story, that voice. But then, I'm probably working or watering the plants or cooking or something else. And so I forget about the story. But after a while, it just comes back. And it comes back and it's begging me to write about it. And that's the winner, right? That's the story that you want to work on. And so some of the stories that I gathered in my collection of short stories, Luces de Emergencia, I'll show the book so you can see it. Luces de Emergencia. Oh, you have it too. Novia, where's your copy? Deal with characters who are trying to escape from that violence. And it's called Luces de Emergencia because I do believe that sometimes there is, a light at the end of the road, and there's some hope for some of these characters. I can read a little bit of that if you want. I don't know if you want me to read in English, or I don't know what my audience is like. I don't know if I should read in Spanish or in English. You tell me.
You may want to go and read something in English because I have a couple of paragraphs here in Spanish that I want to read. So maybe you read in English and I read them in Spanish after you.
Which story were you going to read?
I was working with La Tercera Profecía. No, I'm sorry, Salida de Emergencia.
Okay, that's the one that
exit. Yeah.
That's the one that I had in English, and it's I mean, I don't know. We do have time, but I can read the whole thing or just part of it. So maybe I just look at you and you tell me, like, go on, and then I keep going, or we can stop and then we can talk. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
This was recently translated by Mireia Yamal. And we'll talk about translation later, how difficult it is to translate some of these terms. The title in English would be Emergency Exit. And it deals, I think, precisely with what we're talking about right now. It was him, older, with a receding hairline like his father's, the strands dyed in artificial black, the permanent bags under the eyes, perhaps deeper or more swollen, and the threatening mustache, also dyed and perfectly groomed, like him. How did I not notice during the 3-hour flight from Mexico City? And what was he doing there, sitting on the other side of the aisle, 2 rows in front of me? Was it him? I tried to hide in my seat, to become invisible so he wouldn't discover me. I instinctively put my head down, and I felt my heart beating with urgency, the need to fade away right there and then, the terror of seeing him before me and not knowing how to hide. In the few minutes that passed while the front rows emptied until reaching ours, I rehearsed several possibilities of avoiding or confronting him, uttering again useless prayers, drying my sweaty palms, slowing my breath. The first time I tried to escape, I got all the way to the building's front door, but the neighbor on the first floor had washed the entrance and I slipped on the wet tiles. Sore, I wandered through the streets not knowing where to go. In my desperation, it didn't occur to me to grab my passport, my wallet. He didn't even follow me. He knew I wouldn't get far with my belly. If I didn't escape when I was 2 or 3 months along, how would I do it now that I was about to give birth? When I told my mother-in-law that her son hit me, she was horrified. He's like his father, she responded, shocked, covering her mouth with one hand. Try not to contradict him. Do what he says, Rosita. With men, it's better to just go along. And don't even think of threatening him, because it will be worse for you. I dare you lay a hand on me again and I'll kill you, I exploded one day, armed with the kitchen shears. It took longer for me to speak than it did for me to fall on to the ground, on my knees, begging for forgiveness, paying double, first for serving him cold food and then for trying to defend myself when my lentils slammed against the wall. He got up, smiling, satisfied to leave me on the ground, as usual, happy to have taught me a lesson. It was him, courteous with his neighboring passenger, polite and quite nice, the same one who would return and ask me for forgiveness with a loving gesture, telling me some joke, singing me a song, his enormous arms lifted above him and without difficulty pulled out the carry-on, a leather jacket and a plastic bag. Had he seen me as I passed his seat or in the waiting room? My previous flight had arrived 3 hours earlier. I had a coffee and was one of the first people to present my documents at the service counter. I suppose that's why they offered me a more comfortable seat in the emergency exit row, which did nothing for me during those moments. I sure would have liked to pull the red lever, open the narrow door, and throw myself into the abyss forever, but I've never had the courage to kill myself. I can stop here or I can continue.
You should go and read it, and then I'll just gonna read the passages that I marked in Spanish. But no, please go ahead and read the whole story.
Okay. I allowed several passengers to go ahead of me, and then, when I felt 6, 7, 8 had passed, I began to follow him, clutching my purse, anchoring in my shoes. There are things a woman never forgets. The back of a man, the way he walks, twisting the right foot inward, adjusting his shoulders every 8 or 9 seconds, straightening his neck, fixing his hair. That's why I liked him, because he was tall, elegant, and distinguished, very masculine and highly sought after by the girls in the neighborhood, his bad boy and seductive appearance. I remember one day we were walking together downtown and a guy stole my purse. He was 14 or 15 years old. I don't know. He followed him for a few streets like the thief. He crossed a highly trafficked avenue, avoiding cars speeding by without thinking of his own death. And he caught him. He hit him on the ground, beating him to a pulp. He made him apologize to me. For you, Rosita, I'm willing to kill. He told me at the bus stop, covering me with kisses, and I admire those bruised hands and showed me their love with blows. I had to walk quickly to catch up to him, my heart beating out of my chest, my legs flying through the air. When I was a few feet away from him, I felt the old panic resurface, my heart in my throat. Again, the faltering breath, the terror that he would grab me by the hair and tell me that it was my fault that he died. I stood there with my arms dangling, unable to say a word to him, like the day he threw me out on the street and didn't know what to do with my life. Where could I go looking like that? The woman who raised me told me from the start, if you leave with that low life, forget about me. That man is worthless and everybody knows it. He loves you now, but he will be the end of you. Just kill me, I begged him when my son died, but he let me live, licking my wounds, writhing like a worm. I think he died to stop suffering. I had received blows throughout the entire pregnancy for fading one of his shirts, for putting salt in the coffee, for not opening my legs to him. When he was born, he was a little rat and they had to help him breathe. I don't know how many days he was in the NICU and I couldn't visit him. How could I go if I had to attend to Evelio, if I wasn't even capable of making a healthy son? Don't worry, ma'am, the immigration agent gently approached me. Let me help you find your documents. I knew where they were, but I let him take my purse and look for my passport, opening one zipper, then another, allowing him to move away from me, triumphant, like the last time I saw him. He was about 5 months. I hurriedly bathed him to have time to prepare dinner. He fell asleep while I was breastfeeding him, and I nestled him in the middle of the bed. I made the sign of the cross over him, and I left to finish the chiles rellenos, filled with slices of cheese and onions. I left the rice until last, when I was already placing the chiles in the salsa roja to boil. When he came through the door, he was pleased to see that I had everything ready, that even if I was useless, at least I had learned to prepare his mother's dishes. I served him immediately so I could go to my son, but he made me sit next to him. Between bites, he told me that his younger sister was ill, gravely ill. The following day, he would cross to the other side to see her, and he didn't know when he would be able to return. What about us? What about you? Don't you see my sister's dying? I didn't say anything else and went to look for my son without asking if he would leave money for expenses, if he had paid the rent, or what I should do in case of an emergency. I found him face down, sleeping like an angel. He had turned while I was cooking and died of asphyxiation. He was still warm when I carried him in my arms, but motionless, the way he came into the world. I didn't cry. I lulled him and sang in his ear, feeling myself with his smell, playing with his tiny curls. I didn't cry when he shouted, striking me, calling me a murderer. Kill me, I begged him, waiting for him to crack my head open with his boots so I could join him. I didn't put up a fight when he dragged me and kicked me out the door. I let him leave with my son in his arms, wrapped in his yellow blanket, without demanding anything. Only God knows if he took him to the hospital or to the morgue, if he crossed the border or just abandoned him in the trash. I drifted for days not knowing where to go, searching for death with each step. There's always someone compassionate who offers some bread, a taco, or cardboard to sleep on. If it hadn't been for Senora Martina, who recognized me in the park, I don't know what could have happened to me. Rosita, how have you come to this? She cried when she saw me, absent-minded, and she took me to her house to work. It was him, the man who still makes me fear for my life. Him, after 42 years of chasing me in dreams, with his blows and shouts calling me a murderer. Him, still splendid and handsome, most likely the father of other children, and me, an old defenseless cockroach that still hides at the side of the enemy. Was it him? Staying close to the wall, I grabbed my suitcase without lifting my gaze too much, trying to make myself smaller than I already am. From the corner of my eye, I scanned the area to avoid him, and I placed myself behind a column. With my yellow ribbon suitcase, I went around and behind the carousels that had the packages of other flights. I hurried my pace and gave my paperwork to customs. Anything to declare? Asked the young agent who could have been my son, thin, dark, with sad eyes. I had so much to tell him and words escaped me, the grievances, the defeated pleading, even more so when I felt him pass me and I hung my head again to avoid him. Was it him? I smelt his cologne aged in wood barrels, and I felt the fear of 80-year-old self, the trembling jaw, the saliva pulled up my gums. I ran with my eyes fixed on the ground, searching for an emergency exit, with the terror that he might crush me. I asked the taxi driver to take me to the cemetery where I greet my dead son whenever I can, even if he's not there. To ask for forgiveness for leaving him all alone the day he asphyxiated, so he can take me and we can be two souls without a grave. Rosita and Jose Manuel, two orphan kites swiftly fleeing this cruel world. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Osvaldo. Muchas gracias. So, qué coincidencia. What a coincidence that that was the same one that I picked. So I'm just going to read a couple of passages at the end. And I'm going to read them in Spanish, and then I'm going to ask you a question regarding translation, and then we open it. So everybody, if you have a question or a comment. Lo encontré boca abajo, dormido como un angelito. Se había dado la vuelta mientras yo estaba cocinando y se murió asfixiado. Todavía tibio cuando lo cargué en mis brazos, pero quietecito como vino al mundo. No lloré, me puse a arrullarlo y a cantarle al oído, a llenarme de su dolor, a jugar con sus crespitos que empezaban a nacer. No lloré, cuando a golpes me gritaba asesina, mátame, le rogaba, esperando que con sus botas me destapara la cabeza para irme con él. Corrí con los ojos en el suelo, buscando una puerta de emergencia, con el terror de que me aplastara. Le pedí al taxista que me llevara al cementerio, a donde voy a llorar a mi muerto cada vez que puedo, aunque no esté ahí, para pedirle perdón por dejarlo solito en el día que se asfixió, para que me lleve y seamos entonces dos almas sin tumba, Rosita y José Manuel, dos cometas huérfanas huyendo veloces del mundo cruel.
Suena más bonito en español, creo.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's interesting to listen to it in English too, because you were saying about the difficulties, the intricacies of translation. You have words there like crespitos, which is, I don't know,
Tiny curls.
Tiny curls or buckles. You have there also For example, cometa, which is a comet, but it's also a kite. And in the Caribbean, we call it differently in the three islands that speak Spanish. We call cometa. We have a different word for cometa. So if you go from Dominican Republic, which is chichigua, and you go to Puerto Rico, which is chirimba, you you know, geographically there's a distance, but there's also distance in the same language that is Spanish. In my case, for example, you know, I'm seeing that you have somebody else translated that for, you know, for you. I have one of my short fiction collections translated, but it was somebody else. For me, translating my own fiction, you know, it's like I don't know. Not that I'm not afraid to do it, but it seems like such a big word that I will never finish because I'm gonna be trying to perfect it. And then at the same time, English is not my mother tongue. Like I have enough English to survive. So I want to ask you as a fiction writer too. But at the same time, I have published more academic stuff in English than in Spanish, like written by myself, right? So as a scholar and also a creative writer, how that works out for you, that universe of the metaphorical part of translation, but also the practical part of translation.
It's hard to translate yourself, right? Even if you speak both languages quite well, or your linguistic ability or proficiency is at sort of at the same level, it is super difficult because I think that I have a different set of words in English and a different set of words in Spanish. I had a lot of difficulty translating myself from English into my own native Spanish when I translated A Sip of Benadryl, because I would say things very differently in Spanish if I were writing in Spanish. In this particular short story, it's interesting because I don't translate myself for the same reasons. I would just write a different story, something completely different. And when Mireia translated this particular short story, she did write comet for, cometa. But I went back to kite because I think that's precisely what I want to express in Spanish. And I have other examples too of how some words are like the complete opposite in that they would be in Spanish. I'll just give you one tiny example. I'm not going to read the whole short story, but in Spanish, this story, Los placeres de la carne, the first line says, tenía pasión por las veganas. She translated it as the first time she said, she had a passion for vegan women. She had a passion for vegan, and then I added the women part. She had a passion for vegan women. But it's not quite that, because if I were to write this in English, I would say something like, she had a weakness for vegan women. And because that's exactly what I would like to say in English. So I changed it. And I think that when you're translating, the advantage of knowing both languages is that you have an intuition of what could work and what wouldn't work necessarily. I wonder what happens with writers who just leave everything in the hands of the translator, right? Because they're never able to check the translation. And it might be, Borges would say that the translation is actually better than the original if you have a good translator. But I do wonder, if you're using a lot of colloquialism, if you're using a lot of local expressions, if the translator would be able to actually give you the equivalent in English, for instance.
Well, it's good that you mentioned Borges now, because there is a good example in regards to that. Borges was the translator of William Faulkner in Espanol. And if you follow the movement, like for example, magical realism, the boom literature, like with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, and I will even say even Juan Carlos Onetti, right? Some of them didn't know English enough to read Faulkner comfortably.
Right.
So, for example, you have somebody like Juan Carlos Onetti that he will tell you that his biggest influence was William Faulkner, And what he read was not The Sound of the Fury, for example. What made him fall in love with William Faulkner was Light in August, Luz de Agosto.
Mhm.
But that was one of the books that Borges translated. And after
He
many years,
changes it.
that I took a lot of liberties translating it because nobody will check me out.
Right.
So there was a stuff that I cut it, and then he was saying like, "Oh yeah, that Faulkner, that guy that won the novel, I make him better. I made him readable in Spanish." So those for me are the kind of intricacies, and also with your book, Emergencia, I spend all these days thinking like, okay, you have emergency, which is, related to the violence, and also, the whole idea of, in some ways, denounce violence towards women and toward immigrants. But at the same time, if you go into the word itself, the etymology of the word emerger, so inside the word emergencia, you have also that emergencia is a
Mhm.
hope. You can grow out of, you can emerge, you can emerge out of it. So if I'll be translating, I'll be spending all day thinking about this.
Just the title. Yeah.
I'm never gonna get anything done.
Yeah,
So,
it is complicated, and even like you said, within Spanish, because there are some the Spanish that you would find in some of my short stories, you might say is Peruvian, and then you go to the next story, it might be Central American, and then the next one is very Mexican. Um, and you have to sort of follow your intuition, and you have to hear that internal voice that's sort of dictating the story to you, but you don't know how it will be translated, or how it will be, in the hands of the readers, right?
yeah. Now I want to open the floor, if I may say, to to anybody. Like if you want to ask a question or make a comment to Osvaldo.
Ray, there's a couple of questions in the chat already.
Oh,
If you want to start
let
there.
me see if I open here. uh,
Rashida has a question here.
why the female voice, is that it? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you
It
find
says
it
yes.
difficult to write from female perspective, and why with female narrators?
Yeah, so it just sort of happens that I've read two stories by two female narrators. I never know who will be the narrator in the story, to be honest with you. So I might have a story sort of, in the back of my head when I'm walking through the woods here, and then all of a sudden I just hear the voice of a child, and I hear like, and that's the case in some of the stories, or it's an older person in an assisted living facility, or it might be a student, and it just happens that I heard the voice of a woman who was terrified to see the man who had been so abusive to her, uh, 42 years earlier, and it just sort of came to me, and I think is that how it happens for you, Rey? You just sort of hear that internal voice in the story, sort of dictates, this is my gender, this is who I am.
No, but for me, it doesn't happen. I always, for some reason, when I have tried it before to write from a woman perspective, it didn't work out for me. So for the first time, I'm doing it now in the novel that I'm finishing now, the Seed of Evil, El Germen de lo Fatal. It's the first time that I'm using, and I'm only using it like for a big chapter, because I don't feel safe enough to write from a woman perspective. So I'm doing it for the first time now. But in the same tone, the other question that's there says like, when you think about the story itself, it comes in English or Spanish?
And that depends. Usually I happen to be working on a collection. So, if I'm working on this collection of short stories in Spanish, then all the stories will tend to be in Spanish. But then all of a sudden I wake up one day, and I start writing something in English, and it just sort of, I know that won't be, part of this short story collection. And so I put it on the side and I continue working on that story that's certainly in English. But it just kind of happens that way. But I just wanted to go back quickly to what she said right there. Do you find it difficult to write from the female perspective? Not really. And the thing is that I was raised by a single mother, and I think it really does change your life and your perspective of life when you have a strong female figure in your life who is the breadwinner, who's working really hard, the immigrant who comes to the US. So that voice of my mother is always present here. So I've never found difficulty writing from that perspective. And then I have a question. Do you include some details of your life or experience in your stories? And this is Maria Murillo. I think that we're always stealing stories from people, you know. So I might be looking at some of you right now. I'm like, well, I like that face for a story. And when I write something, I'll be looking at, I'll be thinking of those eyes, and I'll be thinking of, you know, this person who's smiling right there. You're always stealing moments and of your own life as well. So when people say, for instance, in one of the short stories here, one of the main characters is a Central American boy who has traveled to the United States seeking asylum. And, you know, this is not the, you know, he doesn't see or reach the American dream here in the US. I'm not Central American, but in many ways, I'm sort of there, you know, part of, you know, bits and pieces of my own life are inserted into the main character. But I could also be within the, you know, the creation of a female character. And part of what this female character is saying or thinking is my own self saying, you know, some of that. So I do rely a lot on my own experiences, but also on the experiences of others, what I've heard, you know, from a conversation. A lot of times when students come to office hours and they're telling me about their lives, and it could be first generation students, it could be American students, Anglo students, I'm always like, you know, catching little moments here and there. And then it's not like I'm keeping a journal of all this, but when I'm writing, then, you know, all of those situations sort of come to mind, and I twist them and I fix them up a little bit, and then I come up with this.
Okay, now Andre has a question, and then Jelena.
Cool, thank you. And thanks for being here, Oswaldo. And thanks for the great comments about my smile and my eyes. I appreciate those. So I'm really thinking, so I write about borders. That's my area, especially US-Mexico border, but other borders as well. And one of the arguments I've been making for about a decade, and I'm not the first, is that these borders are no longer at the border alone, right? That they're internal to the country. And following feminist theorists, clearly they're internal in people too, right? And I often think about border policing, interior, or self-policing, which is brought up in the first story that you read, as almost being like, I'm reminded from my gay friends who remind me, you don't just come out once, you got to come out 1,000 times, right? Every time you come to a new place and you got to make a choice about whether or not you ought to share who you are with people. And I'm interested in your thoughts, because it strikes me, of course, that we've just gotten through an election with lots of voter suppression and lots of people demobilized. And the fact that people self-police to demobilize, which encourages some and discourages others. So I'm wondering, this really strikes me about being a story about our times, and the fact that that we're no longer worried just about the edges of the country, that policing happens everywhere and on purpose and in really big ways to make a statement about who belongs and who doesn't.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment, for your question. I think that, of course, we're always constantly crossing borders here in the US. And I think of my own self, you know, in many ways, I am in paper, in theory, for instance, an American citizen because I was born here. But there are so many things about myself, my accent, the way I look, my Latinidad, that, you know, if I happen to be in the wrong part of North Carolina, I might be in trouble, you know? So I just recently, last year, for instance, I have a 5-year-old, and I took my daughter I picked her up from school. She was really dirty. Not that it should matter, but we went to ay, ¿cómo se dice? El lugar donde venden las herramientas. Novia, you would probably think
Hardware
the
store.
hardware store. Thank you. The hardware store, and as soon as we walk in there, she's like, "Dad, I need to go to the bathroom," and I'm like, "Not right now. You have to go." And so I'm having to ask for, where's the restroom, and the guy says, "Oh yeah, just go past, that wall right there, and you'll see it." So I went over there, and I didn't see anything, and I asked the guy who's making keys. I say, "Do you know where the restroom is?" He looks at me. He's like, "Does this look like a restroom to you?" And he just started being really aggressive. And I realized at that point that it's because of my look, because of who I am, the way my daughter looks. It looks like, and I'm thinking, if you only knew who I am. But we always have to cross these borders. We're always facing these walls. And when you are the other, and when you are, even if you have a privileged position in the US, such as myself, because I live in a nice neighborhood, I work for a research institution and so on, this sort of theatrical performance can just, be shattered in 2 seconds if you happen to be with the wrong people in some of the most racist places, here in the US. So when I study borders, I also take a look at this, not just the border between the US and Mexico or the physical border, like you said, but also these borders that we have to cross constantly, even when it comes, we've just talked about race and ethnicity, but also when it comes to gender, right? Because the idea of what it's like to be masculine or feminine in Latin America is completely different here, and it varies from community to community. And as Latinos, we have to navigate all these different worlds, and what's acceptable in your country may not be acceptable here, and vice versa. Thank you.
Jelena?
Hola, thank you, Oswaldo. Muchas gracias for reading us, sharing us your work. So I have a question more about developing your identity as a writer towards kind of establishing a Pan-American, writing to a broad audience, right? So you talk about migration, DACA students, gender violence, right? And like you, I was born in the US, but I didn't live here. I lived here less than a year, and then I went back to Chile, where I grew up in Chile and a few other countries in South America before coming to the US to go to college, actually. So that the back and forth and what you mentioned about borders is very familiar. And I never identified as a Latina until I came to the US, right? I was always a Chilena, right? So, and this is something I've talked with my students about, like this flexible situational identity of being Latina or Latin American, etc. So I was wondering if you could speak to how you developed that as a writer and your own persona as a writer.
It's hard. And before I forget, thank you so much. I know you've been behind the scenes working on this and everything. So thank you so much for this. It's interesting to talk about this because I do identify with what you're saying. I remember when I first came from Peru, of course, I was Peruvian and nothing else, not even Latin American, but Peruvian 100%. And when I actually was filling out my application for college, it's, what are the categories? White, Black, Latino, or other. I wrote other because I didn't know what Peruvian was. So I wrote other and I wrote Peruvian at the bottom. It's only been recently that I, when I'm in the US, I tend to call myself nowadays. It's taken me a long time. Now I identify myself as a Latino writer, as a Peruvian-American writer, because I realize that I'm not 100% Peruvian, or not anymore. When I'm in Peru, people always ask me if I'm a foreigner, if I'm from somewhere else. In Spanish, I also have a more Mexican accent than a accent, because when I came, I lived in California and all of my friends were Mexican. I didn't have any Peruvian friends. So at some point, my Peruvian Spanish sort of faded away. And now as a professor of language and literature, I sort of speak a standard Spanish, right, that everybody can understand. When I write my short stories, I don't try at all to come up with a neutral voice. If my character is Peruvian, he will speak like a Peruvian character with Peruvian slang and with bad words in Peruvian slang. And if my character is Mexican, I'll do the same thing. And I sort of hope that the reader gets it, even though I don't have an ideal reader. I do like to connect with my readers. So some of the stories that I write do happen to, deal with migration, with marginality, with otherness, with some of the violence that we experience here in the US. But I hope that they can be translatable, that somebody in a different scenario, in a different country, in a different language can sort of relate to it. I don't know if I'm answering your question quite well, but do you want me to elaborate more? Or
Yeah, no, because I think that what you're saying is it goes on like that because what you want to translate at then is the story. Sometimes we as a writers are gonna focus a lot in the language and the exact words, but I say like if the story is good, it's gonna come through. Doesn't matter. You mentioned earlier, Diaz. There was a lot of controversy with Diaz, which is Dominican American. As you were mentioning, he was born in Dominican Republic. He comes here very early, and the only the only English that he learns, and the language that he learns how to live is English. And the cultural, even though at home is Spanish and is Dominican, his cultural world is Spanish, is English. So when he writes about the Dominican experience, he writes from taking from Star Wars, taking from Star Trek, and all this science fiction in English that he read to explain to you his Dominican experience. When the book goes to Dominican Republic, that even though we learn English in school, but it's not an English enough for you to understand the slang or the reality of the United States, the book has to be translated into Spanish. And then somebody had the idea to translate it into Dominican. And that created a lot of issues between the translator, Achi Ovejas, the author, and the Dominican market, because some people were offended that how is it that you're going to translate it into Dominican? What is it that you're saying? But to say, I just want to say that after I read all those translations, compared with the English, I can see how the story itself, the struggle, the need goes through. It doesn't matter the language, it goes through. And I think that's I have a Dr. Mohammed here has a question. I'm going to give her the floor.
we can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Okay, all right. Yeah, I have a question. When I was working on my doctorate some years ago, I studied an author named Herbert Cole. He was Jewish, but he never learned the Jewish language. He never learned Hebrew or Yiddish. And so as he was growing older, and one of the things that really struck me in his book, and he says, I have feelings that I don't have language for. So he internalized his culture, but he never learned a language. So it seems to me that I think we still have this I don't know, it's like a double voice, or because when he said he had feelings that he didn't have language for, it seems like to me that he understood his culture, his Jewish culture, but he didn't know the language of it. How would that work? How does that work when, you said you grew up there, you were born here. Ray says he grew up here, learned, and it's almost like I had to learn. I learned a lot of my language because my mother is African American. Well, she was half white, but African American, and she grew up in South Carolina. And she told me later in years that she would not speak in her class because she was afraid of her English. Now this woman became an English teacher actually. So, but when she was working on her master's degree, she was still afraid to speak out because of her language pronunciations and enunciations and articulations. So how does that work? I mean, wow.
It's difficult, and I'm always, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but there are times when I don't feel like I'm 100% myself in Spanish, and I'm not 100% myself in English. So there are times, for instance, when I'm teaching a first-year seminar, and I'm teaching this in English, and I find myself fishing for words for terms that I know in Spanish, but I don't know at the moment in front of the students. When somebody's asked me a question, I don't have the vocabulary, and I feel like I'm missing something. And then of course it comes to me when I'm writing something else, and then I come back to that. I have less of that in Spanish. I still feel like Spanish is my dominant language, but there are so many times when you can only express, and I'm sure Jelena can feel this too. There are things that you can only express in Spanish, and there are feelings that you can only express in English. And it's hard for me to explain how that happens or how that's possible. But I can also think of myself and relationships and the people I've dated, I've gone out with in my life. Before I was married, of course, before I got married.
I'll show you why.
And I feel, just to clarify.
Yeah, we don't want you to get in trouble here.
But I feel like I had a different set of variables and a different register in order to love someone in that particular language than I do now, for instance, because my wife is Spanish and we speak Spanish 24/7 here at home. I don't know, it's sort of like you grow this second skin, and that becomes a part of your hybrid identity. And you just have to feel comfortable with that sort of in-betweenness, the fact that you are with one foot here and one foot there, that you're not quite 100% comfortable, in either scenario, but sort of right there in the midst of these two different worlds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Write that down.
That brings us to the hour. So I don't know if anybody. Oh, do you have a question too, Novia? No. So I just want to thank all of you for your time and for being with us today. Thanks Oswaldo for being for sharing his talent with us and I just want to again say thank you. This was a very illuminating hour. We're gonna make sure that we keep sharing our events with you, and thank you all for your support.
Thank you so much. I just want to say quickly, thank you so much. It's always nice to have the opportunity, and thank you, Rey and Novia and Jelena, for inviting me to do this, because you write in solitude and you're crafting your little ideas and you go over it, but it's only when I get to read a story in front of students at a cafe, at a bar, of course the places we can't go now, and when my face actually meets yours and I see that I might be changing your world for just half a second, that those stories become meaningful. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, really. Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we all disperse, I just wanted to say one thing that I did not say in the beginning, which is to thank Amy Sub and the Office of International Services for supporting this event as well. It's part of our International Education Week activities at GSU, and I know there are many more activities coming up over the next couple of days. So thank you so much for that. And if you all are interested in learning more about literature in Spanish or the Hispanic experience in the US, or learning Spanish, so you can read some of these stories in their original forms, come and join us and take some courses in Spanish or in global studies. So, thank you. Thank you so much, Oswaldo. It was lovely to hear you read your own stories.
Thank you, guys.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Thanks today.
Mil gracias, de verdad.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Chao.
Cuídense.
Gracias. Adiós.
Adiós.